Now, Reverend Paley, as he tells the argument in his very precious early 19th century English writing style, asks us to imagine ourselves walking along some heath, right, some wide open scrubland somewhere in England with time on our hands, thinking about things. And then suddenly we kick a rock, or our foot comes up against a rock and we stop. We bend down and we pick the rock up that we've stubbed our foot on, and we look at the rock, and then we start to get all philosophical, and we wonder, why is the rock here? What brought the rock to this particular juncture where my destiny and its destiny collided, and here I am thinking about the rock as a microcosm. And Paley then goes on to say, well, it's not unreasonable in this circumstance to answer the question of why the rock is where it was with an explanation something like the following. They say, many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, the rock started off as some sort of molten chemical somewhere deep in the bowels of the earth, that through some sort of volcanic cataclysm, that material was spewed forth to the surface of the earth where it cooled, that subsequent weather systems, and including tornadoes perhaps, or earthquakes, caused the rock to be broken up, that maybe there were ice ages that came down, and this particular rock was picked up by the ice and then moved, all the while being ground against other rocks and in the ice itself, until the ice age receded to the point and this chunk of rock was spat out, so to speak, at this particular place on an English heath. And it's lain there for no particular reason for thousands of years until I, William Paley, happened to come along and stumble across it, pick it up, and get all philosophical about the origin and ultimate destiny of the rock. Now, Paley says that's fine, right, as an explanation. We can wrap our minds around that explanation. There's nothing in our thinking or our understanding of the universe that militates against that being a possibly true explanation of the rock's existence. But Paley then asks, suppose we change the example a little bit. There you are walking along the heath, thinking philosophical thoughts about the universe, and you kick something, and it's substantial enough that you stop and you bend down wondering what you kicked rather, and you pick it up, and it appears to be a pocket watch. Right? And we imagine an old-fashioned pocket watch where you open the top casing, which is metal, and then it's got a glass casing, and then you notice all of the hands. The hands seem to be capable of movement, and if you wind it up, sure enough, the hands are capable of moving. Perhaps you're even more inquisitive and you start taking it apart, and you notice inside the casing there are all these gears and levers and springs arranged in a very intricate and complicated fashion, such that the hands on the face of the watch, as we're calling it, move with a great deal of regularity. Now, you ask then the same question of the watch that we ask of the rock. How did the watch come to be? What explains this particular constellation or organization of parts in such an intricate fashion? I suppose we told the following story. Well, what happened was many thousands of years ago, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was all of this molten stuff, silica and various forms of iron in the bowels of the earth. And there were various cataclysms that occurred, and all these elements were spewed up and jammed together. And as they cooled, a glacier came along and picked up the proto-watch, so to speak, and tumbled it all around. And all the gears and levers and so forth fell into position. And subject to all sorts of pressures, the metal casing was formed around it. And then the ice age receded, and the watch was spat out again, so to speak, and it's lain there for a long time until I, William Paley, happened to come walking along, stumble over it, pick it up, and get all philosophical about the origin of the watch. And so what do we think of that story of the watch's origin? Well, we think that's absurd, that's ridiculous. There's no way on heaven or earth that a watch would have come into existence through a process analogous to that of the rock. So Paley then says, okay, if that explanation was in principle acceptable for the rock that we tripped over, what makes that same kind of explanation, or that same pattern of explanation, so patently absurd when we try to apply it in the case of a watch? And here the important feature seems to be that the watch is extraordinarily complicated or complex. The order that is built in the structuring arrangement of all of the parts that is built into the watch is many orders of magnitude greater than the structuring order that is built into a rock. So in the case of the very simple kinds of order that we find in rocks and other such beings, we're happy with naturalistic, non-intentional kinds of explanations. But when we're talking about very complicated things like a watch, we're no longer satisfied with simplistic naturalistic explanations. We make an argument that therefore, given the complicatedness of this organizational structure, there has to be an intelligence behind it. There has to be a being who made the watch for a purpose. Given the structure of the watch, there must be a watchmaker. I may never have met the watchmaker. I myself might not be able to make a watch. But nonetheless, I have a great deal of confidence that given the existence of a watch as the kind of structure that it is, there must have been an intelligence behind it that brought it into existence for a particular purpose. Not so in the case of the rock. All right. This issue of complexity then is driving the ship here, so to speak, and then what Paley wants to do is draw the analogy. Of course, we're not interested in explaining the origin of watches. We know where watches come from. We're interested in knowing the origin of ourselves. We're interested in knowing the origin of the universe. Where did we come from? Where did the universe come from? And Paley then argues analogously. We are many orders of magnitude more complicated than a watch, and so if then necessarily the level of complexity in the watch indicates that there must have been a watchmaker or a designer of the watch. Given our level of complexity, the same argument then would dictate that there must be a designer for us who is more intelligent and more powerful than a watchmaker. And then the universe itself, if we blow the argument up to cosmic scale, the universe itself is much more complicated than a rock and even than a watch. So if there necessarily has to be a designer for the watch, there must be a designer for the universe as a whole. And guess who we have in mind there? Of course, it must be God or a godlike being. All right, let's turn now to the board and look at this argument in some greater detail.